In this video, we're going to build on what we've learned about theory of learning and media design to look more specifically at principles of visual design that can support learning. So first, we're going to do a brief theory review some theories that have been in other videos. We'll talk about visual design principles, and then we'll take a little side note on slide design because it's really important and it's what people mix up quite often. So first, theory review. We talked about cognitivism, that we are trying to, often following this model where we're trying to manage working memory and encoding and long-term memory and then retrieval. Many of these principles are based on this cognitivism, including this cognitive load, where when we have an increase in intrinsic cognitive load, which is the difficulty of the material we're learning, and we have an increase in extraneous cognitive load, which is information, images, pictures, bad design that is not related to the material. It can overload working memory, making it more difficult to learn. We've also talked about clustering, that when we group ideas, it helps people remember and connect them better. We can put them into distinct groups. We can create hierarchies, have a sequence of time or group similar ideas to help people store and handle more in that working memory to process. And finally, we talked about Mayer's multimedia learning principles. And I'm just going to review briefly. One is understanding that we have dual channels. We have a visual, a pictorial channel, an auditory or verbal channel. And each of these can be channels that information can come through. And we don't necessarily need to duplicate them. You'll notice that I often do duplicate them to try to make it more understandable if people are reviewing slides and such, but the basic principle is that I wouldn't necessarily want to have these words with these images, for example, but I do to help those reviewing. Another principle is that we have limited capacity. That's like that cognitive load. And by chunking information, that helps us. Another part is this metacognitive strategies, helping us think about and organize what we're learning can also help us learn. And finally, active processing, where we're actually thinking while we're learning. Any media that can support that is going to increase learning. All right, on to visual design principles. And these principles are going to connect to these theories. For example, a lot of them focus on consistency and clarity. And that's about reducing that cognitive load. When we see something that's consistent, our brain gets used to it and it doesn't take extra processing. Or if something's really clear, it takes away that extraneous extra cognitive load to make it easier to learn. We'll also talk a lot about physical layouts of elements, like chunking, connecting, displaying relationships, even with visual pieces that will also help us understand and remember what we learn. So here are the design principles we'll talk about: contrast, proximity, repetition, alignment, hierarchy, and white space. We're just going to look at each of these briefly. So first is contrast. Contrast, again, is going to decrease that cognitive load because it's going to be easier to understand what you're looking at. So we can have good types of contrast and we can have bad contrast. You see this one down here in the corner, it kind of has like a vibration almost that makes it hard to look at. So even though it's very well contrasted, it's not a good type of contrast. This one over here just doesn't have enough contrast. Generally, if you have a dark background, you want to use a light text. If I have a dark brown and dark text, you can read this, but it takes a little bit more effort than this one, and we want to reduce that effort. If we have a light background, we want to have a dark text on top of it. Technically, again, we can read the light background on light text, but it's more difficult, and we want to make it as simple and easy as possible. The next thing we're going to look at is a little bit about, we got two more contrasts. This is showing how contrast can help us group ideas. So the fact that these two are one color and these contrast help us see those groups differently. If we change that, we're going to be grouping them differently in our brain. So we can actually use that contrast to support that ordering of elements and understanding the connection between ideas or thoughts or images. I'm going to share just a couple examples in visual design. Most visual design, like for media and other things, they follow these principles because it also has better effects on actually selling things and helping people understand a product. So here's some examples. This is from Adobe Express, shares these examples of good contrast. This one right here, normally I'm not a big fan of having an image behind a text like this, but they were able to pop it out enough that it's still readable. This isn't quite as good than, for example, these two that are very simple, I think. But it, in certain purposes, if you want to emphasize that image, that might be appropriate. The next principle is proximity. That just has to do with where things are placed, what they're close to. So we're going to look at our stars and smileys again. Right now, they're just about evenly placed apart. But if we move them so that they move closer together, that helps us link the ideas in certain ways. We can also move them farther apart. It helps us differentiate those ideas. Or we can group them a little bit differently. Now we can think of stars together and smileys together. Whereas this one, it's more like stars and smileys, stars and smileys. So when you're designing for learning, you can cluster ideas like this to help people understand them visually through images or even words. Here's some more examples of proximity. Here's some media examples. What you'll notice here is they put the words that go together. So they want to emphasize National Book Lovers Day and having that text with it. They want to keep the image and the caption close by each other to help people connect the image and the caption. And then this is kind of like in the middle, but it connects with the save the date because of its proximity. You can also have bad proximity. And these are kind of fun to see in the world around us. Take action, take control, quit. And then there's the school bus right here. So, because those are connected, we connect those ideas. This one, suicide event 4:30, because they put a line here, they're trying to differentiate that we're talking about suicide, which is an event. But because they're still so close together, it still looks like suicide event. And then this one, don't save a life, be afraid to give blood. They tried to differentiate that save a life and blood through a different color, but because the proximity was so close, we still often will read it the other way. I have a couple examples that students have made. So this is one from Kelly Perret. She's in Louisiana. And she showed that when we put the caption really close to the image, it helps us keep that connection. The closer the elements in a composition are, the stronger the relationship is between them. That's proximity. Next is repetition. Repetition is another way to help us group ideas and to reduce cognitive load because our brain gets used to the main idea. So just one example for this briefly, because you see that these are all a similar style, that although they change colors, the shapes keep that repetition that makes all of these look like they go together. Okay. Another way for repetition is just to be consistent, to always use the same fonts. At most use 2 different fonts, use similar styles of fonts and images to try to keep that cognitive load low. Even though we're not conscious necessarily of having to think more when things are different, it still can kind of affect our brain and our thinking. Next is alignment. This is another way to cluster ideas. So we can have our stars and smileys, and if we align them differently like this, then we look like we have a big idea and a sub-idea. So based on how we align them, it's going to form different connections in our brain. Here's some professional examples. This one's really interesting because it has this right aligned text where, let me show you this one first. This is different text alignments where we have a left aligned where the straight line's on the left, right, the straight line's on the right, center, it's all centered on the middle, and justified, you have the straight line both places. So if we look at this example, we have a right aligned and then a left aligned, and that alignment actually brings together those 2 pieces, which is interesting. Notice this is right aligned. Left aligned. Most of the time you want to use left aligned text. We tend to use center, that's okay every once in a while, but generally you want to left align. And these are just uses of vertical. These aren't totally my favorite, but it's another way to align. So let's just talk briefly about these text examples. When we want to make things the easiest to understand, we generally want left aligned, because what happens is someone's reading here, they get to the end of the line and their eyes have to go back and find the beginning of the next line. If the beginning is always in the same place, that's going to reduce cognitive load. Versus is if the beginning is somewhere different each time, that's going to increase extraneous load because their eyes have to find the beginning every single time. If it's right, it's the same thing. They have to find the place. And then justified just adds random spaces. As it's trying to align both sides, it has to change the spacing of the words. Generally, if you're going to have more than 2 lines of text, you want to left align it. If you just have, 1 or 2 lines, center align is okay, but more and more frequently in visual design, they're encouraging people to left align because that's just easier on the eyes and more clear than centering. And right, this is a reason to use right text because it connects, but if this was a whole paragraph, they definitely would not use right alignment. Okay, next is hierarchy. Hierarchy has to do with what's above something else, generally visually. So right now, the star is the main idea, the smile is the detail. We can flip that, okay? We create hierarchy in text by size and placement. So, they're going to emphasize the we're open. So even though this is in the middle, it's a bigger text, so it stands out. When they do this menu, they group the ideas, the mains, the sides, and the drinks through hierarchy, through the size of the text, and then also through these boxes help us connect the ideas. Okay? When we do headings, we want to make them very clear. So although this could be headings, it's not overly clear to our eyes. We want to make a clear difference. We can do that with color, with bold, with font, but overall making the hierarchy clear. Finally, we have white space. White space is letting there be space to breathe. You don't have to fill every single space on an image or a slide or an infographic. This is one of my favorite quotes. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. If you think of cognitive load, we want to make it as simple and clear and pleasant as possible. And if we take away everything we can, it leaves something clean and clear. Look around you in the world and you'll notice a lot of time when you see something and you're like, that's really good design, you'll notice that it's very simple and there's a lot of white space. You can actually use white space actively too. This is like active white space that actually leads our eyes down. So the goal is to guide the viewer down the page through the pathway. So that's an active white space. Alrighty, so I'm going to show you a few examples that use text. So first is proximity. So we have these lists of animals and trees. By grouping them in different ways, we can put the ideas together. We can also try to group them by the content. So the content is that we added the animals' names and we added the trees and we added some white space. That helps us group them as well. Normally, if you have a heading, you want to keep the text below it close to the heading. So if you look at this one, go back one, it almost looks like animals. We know because of the content these are animals, but it doesn't necessarily look like this heading goes with this section. So whenever you have a heading, you want to have the stuff that goes with that right next to it, and then have a space before the next heading with the words that go with the headings right next to it. You can also emphasize that with hierarchy, so they kind of indented this. You can change it with font. Here I just underlined it. Notice again that we're going to keep the animals, the heading with the details, and the main idea with the details. The space is before the heading. We can do it with color, but we don't want to do it like this with fonts because that leads to cognitive overload. All right, this is a longer video, but I just want to briefly talk about slides because this is a common error. We've all been places where someone says, "Why are we here? We're going to talk about our sales target." And it's exactly what their slides say. It gets very annoying, and it doesn't actually follow Mayer's multimedia principles. When we do slides or videos, especially if we're taking a slide and we're making a video of it like I'm doing, you want to use the image for visual clarity and enrichment for those pictorial channels. And then the words can be explanation, conversation, dialogue. All right. So if you are creating slides to present either on a video or in person, a lot of the time we want to keep that actual image clear with limited words. Now, there are reasons to add words. One is I think of, if someone's going to flip through my slides, I want them to understand it. Some is for accessibility, so that screen readers can understand it. So you do have to weigh those options. Another is just time. And if you have too many images, sometimes they can lose their relevance. It can be hard to remember why an image is some certain image. So there's a balance, but the important thing is to not be reading slides and not put every word on your slide. Here's a slide I meant, which of course I added words that I'm going to read. If you do have words, you do kind of want to read them because it's confusing if you're saying one thing while the viewer is reading something else. So slideument is like when you have a document that you give to people to look at. All right, so you're not planning on presenting it. It's just a way to organize ideas. So then you can have more text. You can think of it more like you're designing magazine pages, and often it's good to share it as a PDF instead of a slideshow to make it easier to read. Again, it depends on your purpose. All right, final quote. Practice design, not decoration. Don't just make pretty talking points. Display information in a way that makes complex information clear. We're focused on that pleasant and clear and simple. All right? All right, we talked about this. We're going to skip it and do takeaways. So remember that careful visual design, it can help us decrease cognitive load, it can support chunking of ideas, and it can illustrate connections and relationships. Thanks for watching.